I finished my master's degree back in May and did what any sane person does after 2 years of obsessing over watershed erosion patterns. I went hiking, solo 5 days on the Appalachian Trail, specifically in the Blue Ridge section in Virginia. I'd spent plenty of time alone in the Rockies, so I wasn't the least bit worried. Honestly, I was a little smug about it. People talk about the AT like it's some deep, dark wilderness, but it has white blazes painted on every tree every few hundred yards, designated campsites with bear boxes, and its own Wikipedia page. How dangerous could it be? I started just outside Waynesboro on a Tuesday. The first 2 days were actually perfect. Great weather, making about 12 miles a day, sleeping like a log, and eating my little dehydrated meals. The whole bit. But the Appalachians feel different than the mountains out west. They're older somehow, heavier. The air just sits differently in those trees. I noticed it, sure, but I didn't let it get to me. On the third morning, I woke up to find my GPS was dead. I put a brand new battery in it the night before. I tried my backup power bank, but that was dead too. It was weird, definitely, but I had proper maps and a compass, and I was on a trail with markers every few hundred yards. So I did the reasonable thing and kept moving. I'd been hiking for maybe 2 hours when I ran into him. I was taking a water break at a small clearing, just sitting on a log, filtering water from a creek, when this guy stepped out of the trees, not from the trail, but from the trees. It felt like he'd just been standing back there, waiting. He looked to be in his mid-40s, camo pants, a torn flannel shirt, hair pulled back in a greasy long ponytail. He had a thick beard and these pale blue eyes, the kind that look washed out, like the color had been diluted over time. He looked straight at me and said, "You look lost, friend." Keep in mind, I was sitting about 4 feet away from the bright trail markers. I told him I was fine, just taking a breather. He introduced himself as Billy, said he'd lived in these mountains his entire life, knew every trail, every spring, every hollow. He had this way of talking that seemed friendly on the surface, but felt completely wrong underneath. You know that feeling when you're on the phone with someone and you can just tell they're smiling, but you know it's not reaching their eyes? It was kind of like that, except I couldn't even see his eyes properly. I just felt it in my gut. Billy told me there was a better route, not the main trail, but a shortcut that would shave off 8 miles and take me through parts of the mountains tourists never saw. Hidden waterfalls, old Cherokee sites, places where the mountain was still, as he put it, still alive. He was so enthusiastic about it, he genuinely seemed like he wanted to share something special. Every instinct I had was screaming no. This guy had materialized out of air in the middle of thousands of acres of wilderness. He knew I was alone. He was inviting me off a marked trail into an area where anybody and nobody would ever find me if things went south. The alarm bells were deafening. But here's the catch. He knew the area, cold. He could describe landmarks I could see in the distance and name them perfectly. He mentioned a section of the main trail that had washed out in a recent storm. Told me exactly where it was, and when I checked the map, it lined up. He wasn't making it up. He really did know these mountains. That was what got me. I told myself I was being paranoid, that I was just some city brain person projecting a horror movie onto a friendly local. I said yes. The first hour was actually okay. He led me off the main trail onto what used to be a logging road, though it was mostly swallowed by the forest now. Billy was a decent guide, pointing out edible plants, showing me deer tracks, and talking about the local history, coal families, old homesteads, the mines that had chewed up these mountains before being abandoned. Then he mentioned, casually, that people still go missing out here every year, mostly hikers who wander off the marked trails. He said he talked about how easy it is to get turned around once the blazes stop. I didn't think much about it at the time. About 2 hours in, things started to change. We hadn't seen any of the landmarks he'd promised. No waterfalls, no Cherokee sites, just more forest. When I brought it up, he claimed there had been some recent landslides and we were taking a longer way around. Fine. But then I realized we weren't even following a path anymore. He was just walking through the woods. We were threading through trees, climbing ridges, dropping into hollows with no trail and no destinations I could recognize. When I stopped and asked to see my map, he just laughed and said maps were useless out here because the terrain changed too much after a storm. And that was when I heard the first branch snap behind us. I tried to tell myself I was just being paranoid again, just a deer, but then it happened again off to the left and once more behind us. The sounds were too evenly spaced, too deliberate to be an animal. Something was pacing us, something that knew exactly how to say just out of sight. I asked Billy about it. His entire face shifted. The friendliness just evaporated. His eyes went flat and cold, and he looked at me the way you look at a problem you're trying to solve. He said his boys were just making sure we didn't run into any trouble. He told me the mountains could be dangerous for someone who didn't know their way around. I asked him what kind of trouble. He just smiled. He said there were all kinds of predators in these woods, and some of them walked on 2 legs. I told him right then that I wanted to go back to the main trail. Now, he laughed and asked if I even knew which way it was. I looked around, dense canopy in every direction, no sun in sight, no landmarks I knew. We'd been walking for hours and I had absolutely no idea where I was. He told me not to worry, said they had a camp nearby, hot food, cold beer. I could rest up and they'd get me back to civilization in the morning. The way he said it, the way he said civilization, made my blood turn to ice. I told him I needed to use the bathroom and stepped behind a massive oak tree. The second I was out of his line of sight, I ran. Running through a dense Appalachian forest is nothing like running on a trail. Every single step is a gamble, and there are roots everywhere. The ground is hidden under layers of leaf litter, and the branches whip your face and arms. Visibility was maybe 10 feet in any direction. I could hear shouting behind me, Billy calling my name, telling me I was being stupid and that I'd get lost and die without him. I ran until my lungs felt like they were going to burst, maybe 20 minutes, maybe 30. I finally stopped behind a fallen log and tried to listen over the sound of my own ragged breathing. That was when I heard the whistling. It wasn't a song, it was sharp, short bursts, signals, and they were coming from at least 3 different directions around me. They were communicating, they were coordinating, they knew these woods and I didn't, and they were hunting me like an animal, and they were calm about it. I forced myself up and kept moving uphill. I remember from my maps that the main trail followed a ridgeline. If I could get high enough, I might be able to spot something, get some kind of bearing on my whereabouts. The whistling started to fade as I climbed. It was still there, echoing up from the valleys, but it was fainter. I just kept going. Right before sunset, I crested a ridge and saw it, a white blaze on a tree about 50 yards away. I have never been so grateful for a splash of paint in my life. I hit the trail and ran south, 5 miles to a road crossing. I ran most of it in the pitch black, my flashlight bouncing from blaze to blaze, never stopping. I made it to the road around midnight and flagged down the very first pair of headlights I saw. It was a county sheriff's deputy. He took one look at me, torn clothes, face sliced up by branches and wild eyes, and asked what the hell happened. I told him everything. He didn't even look surprised. He said I wasn't the first hiker to report being led off trail by helpful locals in that specific part of the Blue Ridge. 3 people had gone missing in the last 2 years, all solo hikers, all in the same general area. His department suspected a group of men living off-grid in the forest, targeting people who were alone and vulnerable, but the terrain was too rough and the forest was just too big. They'd never been able to track them down. I never found out what Billy really had planned. I've thought about it, obviously, in the years since. The camp they had, the rope they must have had, what happens to the people who don't run? I don't really want to know. I haven't hiked alone since then, not once. Whenever I tell this story, people always ask what the lesson is, like there needs to be some big takeaway. There isn't one, really. Sometimes you trust your instincts and it saves your life, and you still can't fully explain why you almost didn't. The mountains are beautiful, that's true, but Billy was right about one thing. There are predators in those woods that walk on 2 legs, and some of them are very good at acting like they want to help. My grandfather died last October at 93 and left me a cabin. I didn't even know the cabin existed. That was the first red flag. My grandfather Samuel had moved north from West Virginia in the 1950s, built a whole life in Maine, and raised a family. He never talked about where he came from. If you asked, he'd just change the subject or give you some vague line about wanting better opportunities. The usual story. The few times I really pushed him, he'd go quiet and say, "Some places are better left in the past." I just assumed he meant poverty, coal county, hard memories, so I stopped asking. The estate lawyer called me 3 weeks after the funeral. He told me my grandfather had left me everything, the house in Portland, his savings, and a piece of property in West Virginia that he'd never mentioned to anyone. 47 acres in a hollow called Serpent's Gap. About 30 miles from the nearest town, it was a log cabin built in the early 1900s. No electricity, no running water, accessible only by a dirt road that turned into a swamp in bad weather. The property taxes were practically nothing. The lawyer actually suggested I just sell it to a timber company and not even bother making the trip. But something made me go anyway. The drive took me 2 days. I spent the night in Beckley and drove out to Serpent's Gap in the morning, passing through towns that looked like they were being slowly erased. Empty storefronts, boarded up windows, and the occasional person on a porch who watched my car pass without waving. The dirt road up to the cabin was barely wider than my Civic. Branches scraped both sides of the car the entire way. The cabin was actually in better shape than I expected. Log construction, a stone chimney, even had a covered front porch. The roof still looked solid. It was clear someone had been maintaining it. I noticed it immediately because the weeds around the entrance were cleared and the porch was swept and nothing had been left to rot. The front door wasn't even locked. Inside, I found simple handmade furniture, a stone fireplace, 2 bedrooms, and shelves full of books, but there were also things that didn't quite fit. A battery-powered radio with fresh batteries, canned goods with expiration dates from the last couple of years, clothes hanging in the bedroom closet that I recognized, a flannel shirt my grandfather had worn for as long as I could remember, and a pair of work boots I'd seen in old photos. He'd been coming back here regularly for what I can only assume was decades. Given how settled everything looked, he'd kept a secret retreat in the West Virginia mountains and never told a soul. Not his kids, not his wife, nobody. I spent the first day going through his things. Most of it was pretty ordinary. Old hunting magazines, basic supplies, but tucked under the bed in his room was a wooden chest. Inside were photographs, letters, and what looked like journal entries going way back to the 1940s. The photographs were what stopped me first. The early ones showed my grandfather as a young man with a group of people, 8 or 9 of them, all posing at different spots on the property. Hunting trips, family gatherings, and some kind of seasonal celebration in the woods. They were happy pictures, normal pictures, but as I went through them in order, the groups got smaller. By the early 50s, it was only 5 people. By the late 50s, only 3. By the time I hit the 60s, my grandfather was alone in almost every single photo. I sat there for a long time before I finally opened the journals, and he called it the feeding schedule. The early entries were incredibly matter-of-fact, like he was writing about any other household chore. He and the extended family took turns visiting the property during the warmer months, at least once a month, to leave offerings at a place they called the Mouth. Fresh meat usually, deer or rabbit. The spot was a cave opening about 2 miles up the mountain from the cabin, in a grove of trees where nothing else grew. He wrote about it like he was maintaining a well, a necessary thing, something that just had to be done. As I read further, I started to understand what he thought he was maintaining. Something old lived in those mountains. He wrote something that was there long before his family, long before white settlers, something the Cherokee knew about and had their own relationship with. His family had made some kind of agreement with it generations ago. In exchange for keeping it fed and keeping it from wandering down into the valleys, it protected the land and the people on it from outsiders who meant harm. The arrangement had worked for as long as anyone could remember. The rules were ironclad. You couldn't skip the feedings. You couldn't leave without finishing your obligations. One entry from the late 40s described what happened to his cousin Robert, who tried to move to Charleston without finishing his assigned duties. Robert's car was found a week later, completely destroyed. There was no sign of Robert. My grandfather wrote that the family all knew exactly what had happened. There was nothing to do but keep honoring the agreement. One by one, they'd all gone, died, disappeared, or moved away and came back changed, hollowed out. By the time I was reading this journal, my grandfather was the last one left. He'd been carrying this weight alone for decades. The later entries were painful to read. He was in his late 80s, early 90s, and the trips to the mountain were getting harder. His handwriting had turned into a shaky scrawl. He wrote about being able to feel the thing in the hills growing restless, the same way you can feel the pressure change before a storm. He tried to find family members to take over, reached out to cousins and distant relatives, but everyone who'd moved away from the mountains wanted nothing to do with what they saw as old superstitions. The last entry was dated 3 months before he died. He wrote that he was too sick to make the trips anymore and he could feel it, hungry, circling, aware that its caretaker was fading. He decided to leave the property to me, his only granddaughter. He hoped I might understand what the others hadn't. At the bottom of the chest, wrapped in canvas, was a hand-drawn map. The mouth was marked with a small circle. There were detailed instructions for what kind of offerings were acceptable, how to approach, and what to do if you heard the calling song. I sat in that cabin reading by oil lamp until well after dark, trying to figure out how I felt about all of this. The rational part of me wanted to write it off as the isolated beliefs of a mountain family fueled by generational fear. Old folklore given weight by coincidence and passed down until it felt like fact. But my grandfather had maintained this for 60 years, long after he moved away and built a completely different life. He'd come back month after month alone without ever telling anyone. That isn't just superstition, that's an obligation. I was still holding the journal when the sound started. It came from the forest around the cabin, a low humming, almost like singing, but not quite. Not human exactly, but not animal either. It had a pattern to it, and tension. It circled the property slowly, never getting close enough for me to see anything through the dark windows. I found the entry in the journal almost immediately. He described this exact sound, the calling song. It meant the thing in the mountains had sent someone new at the cabin. It was curious, it was assessing me. The humming went on for about an hour, then it just stopped. I didn't sleep a wink that night. In the morning, I packed up the journals, the photos, the map, and I drove back to Maine. I've told almost nobody about what I found. What would I even say? That my grandfather spent 60 years feeding something in the West Virginia mountains and now it's my problem? I think about the cabin sometimes. 47 acres in Serpent's Gap, the map with the mouth marked on it, the instructions he left for me. I wonder if the agreement is still in effect. I wonder if something like that just expires when the last caretaker dies, or if it just sits there, waiting. I haven't gone back, but I haven't sold it either, and I'm not entirely sure I can explain why. But let me be straight with you before I start. I was 21, I was an idiot, and I went looking for trouble in a place that had plenty of it to spare. What happened to me wasn't exactly unpredictable, I just didn't see it coming. I was a journalism student at Northwestern. Junior year, spring break, while my fraternity brothers were in Cancun, I drove to West Virginia because I had this idea that there were authentic American stories in rural Appalachia that nobody was telling, moonshine culture specifically. I'd read that traditional legal distilling was still happening in the backwoods of Kentucky and West Virginia. Families who'd been making corn liquor the same way for generations, totally outside the legal economy. I thought if I could get access to that world and write about it honestly, it would be the kind of piece that launched my career. Looking back, I was basically a 21-year-old in a polo shirt, driving into coal country with a recorder and a camera, thinking he was some big shot reporter. I deserved what almost happened. I spent a week driving through small mountain towns, eating at diners, talking to people at gas stations, just trying to get some kind of lead. Most people gave me nothing. Either they didn't know anything or they were smart enough not to tell a college kid from Chicago. But in a town called Colton, I got lucky or unlucky depending on how you look at it. I was having breakfast at a truck stop when two guys at the next table started talking about someone named Old Pete and his latest batch. Something about the copper being off. When they left, I followed them outside and introduced myself. Told them I was a college student writing about Appalachian culture, interested in traditional mountain crafts. The older one, Dale, looked at me for a long time before he said a word. He had a weathered face, calloused hands, and clothes that smelled like tobacco and motor oil. He had this particular stillness of someone who spends a lot of time outdoors and has learned to be careful about strangers. After a few minutes of questions, what did I want? Why? Who would read it? Would names be used? He seemed to make some kind of decision. There was a man named Pete Hartley, Dale said, who ran a traditional operation up in Bent Creek Hollow, about 30 miles deeper into the mountains. Pete was suspicious of outsiders. He didn't like strangers showing up unannounced. But if Dale vouched for me, Pete might be willing to talk. Dale's warning was quiet but very clear. What Pete did was still illegal. If I was planning to write anything that brought the law to his operation, Dale would make sure I regretted it. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't have to. I got the message. I met Dale at a gas station the next morning. He drove us in a beat-up pickup truck through increasingly narrow mountain roads, then onto what I first thought was a hiking trail before I realized it was just a very rough dirt road. Tree branches scraped both sides of the truck the entire way up. After 45 minutes, we came out into a natural clearing hidden under the forest canopy. Pete's operation was much bigger than I'd expected. Several buildings were scattered around the clearing. A log cabin, a large shed that was clearly the distillery, and smaller outbuildings for storage. The whole thing was invisible from above. The trees provided complete cover. You could only get to it by that one rough road. Pete himself was in his 60s with a long gray beard and overalls. He had the quiet confidence of a man who'd spent his whole life on one piece of land. He agreed to show me around, made it clear I was a guest only because of Dale, and told me not to expect any special treatment. And honestly, the moonshine operation was fascinating. Pete was using equipment his grandfather had built, copper stills he'd repaired and maintained himself, following a process handed down over 4 generations. He knew it intuitively, in his bones. He let me taste several different batches and explain the nuances. I was taking mental notes furiously, already picturing the article. But in the late afternoon, people started arriving. ATVs and pickups coming through the same rough road. Pete introduced them as customers and friends. They were polite enough, but I could feel them assessing me, trying to figure out what I was doing there. I made my first mistake around then. I asked Pete if I could photograph the equipment, specifically him working at the still. The entire clearing went dead quiet. Dale pulled me aside and explained, in a low voice, that I had just asked Pete to create photographic evidence that could be used to prosecute him and shut down a family operation that existed for nearly a century. I apologized. I put the camera away and the tension eased slightly, but the vibe had shifted now. Then the newcomers started arriving who weren't customers. A man in his 30s on an ATV with a large backpack. He went directly to Pete and they had some kind of transaction. Cash exchanging hands, small packages going back the other way, and it very clearly had nothing to do with moonshine. I watched. I know I shouldn't. I was 21 and I had that journalism student's reflex towards information. I watched and I tried to hear what they were saying. The man with the backpack noticed. He asked Pete who I was and why a stranger was present during a business meeting. Pete explained. Dale's guest, college kid, writing about moonshine. The man wasn't satisfied. He pointed out that I'd already tried to take photos and now I was obviously listening to private conversations. The armed men, and I noticed then that several of the newer arrivals were carrying things that weren't hunting rifles, moved to form a loose ring around me. This wasn't a traditional moonshine operation with some colorful local characters. This was a criminal organization that used Pete's remote compound as a meeting point and distribution hub for things that went way beyond illegal liquor. And I had walked into the middle of a business meeting, asked to photograph it, and then gotten caught eavesdropping. The man with the backpack said that bringing an outsider to the compound during a meeting was a serious breach. He said there needed to be consequences to make sure it didn't happen again. That was when they brought out the rope. He looked genuinely sorry. He didn't try to stop it. Dale just shook his head and said he'd warned me. I survived. I won't go into the details of the next few hours. What I will say is that I drove back to Chicago at the end of spring break with a very different understanding of what consequences actually means, and I never wrote that article. Some stories you find out you don't actually want to tell. Some information costs more to have than it's worth. I learned that in a clearing in the West Virginia mountains at 21 years old, and the lesson stuck.